'Tis the season for Christmas card preparation. I know this because I got my first email this past week about what our address was, and I realized that's because people are sending Christmas cards. And we know how it works. You dress up your family, and you hope that amidst all of the reality of chaos, of dressing kids up in a tie and shirt and sweater vest and dresses and shoes, that somewhere in that chaos, the photographer will catch the perfect family photo. And we all know that this is how it goes. And yet, so often we have our memories shaped by these photos, that this is how it was. The perfect idealized family portrait is what life should be. Unfortunately, reality will never live up to these photos. If these perfect portraits are our standard for what a family should look like, we will always be let down. We will always be overwhelmed by this standard. It's too high a standard for any human family to live up to, no matter how healthy and loving they may be. Thank goodness for the good folks at Awkward Family Photos, who give us a glimpse of what life really is. The text we're reading today from the book of Acts is more on the idealized family portrait end of the spectrum. But as we zoom out from the verses that we'll read, we'll see that beneath the surface and in the surrounding context, there are way more ways that we connect with the early church than we might expect. And so our text is from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. This is on the day of Pentecost, or this is after the day of Pentecost. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the good will of the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, this is a beautiful picture, and it's important for us. It's inspiring. It's informative of what the church invested in and focused on in its early days. But it's also overwhelming, because as we look at that, it's like those idealized family portraits. There's no way we could live up to them. And some of us can't even get to the instruction because we're so overwhelmed with the burden of all the ways we're not doing what those early apostles and Christians did. Are we performing wonders and signs? Well, maybe in less obvious ways. Are we always together and sharing all things in common? Well, sometimes we're together and we share some things in common. Do we sell all our possessions and distribute everything to the poor? Well, we give what we can and we do our part, right? Do we spend each day together and set tables and homes and in the temple? Well, we live busy lives, but we sneak it in there when we can. Are we always praising God and enjoying the goodwill of all the people? Well, maybe to sometimes we praise God and there are people who appreciate us, right? But in reality, we can maybe catch glimpses of who we are and what we've inherited and how we practice the Jesus life in this text, but it can feel really distant. That's why it's good to remember that this isn't the whole story. The scriptures, whatever they do not pull punches about the reality and the messiness of human life. The book of Acts itself, if we just read on, we see that it wasn't ever neat or easy. There were always challenges that they faced within and without. So in chapter 4, did they enjoy the goodwill of all the people? Really? No, in chapter 4, they face outside persecutions from the same leaders who crucified Jesus. Well, what about inside? Did everyone sell all their possessions and give everything they had to the poor? Well, no. They faced inside struggles with people pretending to be more generous than they were in order to gain stature and power within the community. And then later in chapter 5, again, we have jealous outsiders wanting to cling to the status quo and feeling threatened by this new Jesus movement. And in chapter 6, we see inside issues of favoritism when it came to distributing the wealth that they had shared and the food that they were sharing together. Well, some people were giving more to some and less to others based on what kind of person they were, or what racial and religious and social makeup or role they had. And then we see dispersion, we see disagreement among them. In chapter 10, they're still setting boundaries on who can receive God's grace and who can't. And in chapter 15, we see a heated church meeting about how they were struggling to merge old traditions with the new works of the Spirit. And it goes on and on. There is no perfect church. And beyond that, the church community that we see in Acts 2, it doesn't exist today. As vibrant and devoted and fruitful as they were, that congregation no longer exists. Even great faithfulness doesn't guarantee eternality to any form or congregation. They were dispersed and persecuted and struggled in the shadow of the Roman Empire and the Jewish temple. And eventually that powder keg exploded in the year 70 AD when the Romans crushed a rebellion and destroyed that temple. And so, as beautiful as this picture that we have in Acts 2 is, there is no unbroken line. There is no congregation, no single congregation that traces itself back to this ragtag group in Jerusalem who just met where they could in the temple and in homes and broke bread and devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and prayers. And the reality is that for centuries, this is how the church has lived. Congregations have come and gone, loved and left, risen and fallen, blessed and failed and faded away, stumbled forward, passing on a baton or batons, and we have somehow received miraculously and imperfectly their story and their table and their sense of connection where divine and human have come together there. That is what we are stewards of. We are now the stewards of that story and that table and that sense of connection that happens within those. Churches have been planted and closed. Movements and denominations have come and gone. And I think there is something profoundly beautiful about that if we have eyes to see. There is something so deeply gospel, so powerfully Jesus about that. Incarnation and death and resurrection are built into the essence of the movement. It hasn't survived in one body or one form. The church doesn't exist today because one congregation held on to their liturgy or their building or their name for thousands of years. It has been born and died and raised anew thousands of times in the millennia since Jesus died and was raised again. And so what's beautiful or profound or powerful about that? Well, it's not about us. It's about Jesus. And it's about the Spirit of Christ blowing like wind through the trees, scattering seeds on the ground, some of which never volunteer and some of which pop up. Who knows which is which? It's less of a planned garden and more of a forest, natural, organic, and beyond any one tree or the intent of any particular squirrel burying its acorns. And at the same time, it's so far beyond what we can control. The embodiment of Christ by each Jesus follower, each congregation, each denomination or movement, the imperfect faithfulness with which each of us has stewarded the good news of Jesus and the table and that connection. Each meal and story and each connection have been precisely what it's all about. And so somehow, any particular table and any story and any connection really doesn't mean anything. But at the same time, each particular table and story and connection is everything that it's all about. As a church today, we can be hard on ourselves sometimes. We can forget that we are part of major movements inside and outside the church, as the church always has been. Right now, we are living in an age of reckoning in our culture, in our time and place. On the outside, think about some of the waves that we're trying to go up against. Name one institution that is more trusted today than it was 60 years ago. Name one. Name one place-oriented social group that is thriving more than it was 60 years ago. Right? These are some of the external forces that are just bigger than us. And then the inside, we're reckoning, just like the early apostles did, with ways that we have participated in unjust systems and been unloving and unlearning when it comes to race and gender and people who experience their sexuality in different ways. And we are indeed mired in forms of church that hinder adaptation, agility, and encounter with the deepest realities of our souls. But the key here is none of this is unique. These internal and external forces have always made the church a messy and beautiful place. We have always been a people of death and resurrection, a place where sinner and saint coexist, not only in one community or one congregation, but sinner and saint coexist in one human body. Particular expressions of Christ have always been born and grown and died just as Christ himself did. And so let's just sit in that reality for a moment. That preservation of these particular forms is ultimately beyond our control, is ultimately futile. And really, trying to preserve these forms and names and things can actually be at counter purposes with the gospel itself, if the gospel is about death and resurrection. So what are we to do? Now that we've deconstructed this myth that the church has ever been perfect and pure, and now that we've essentially said, hey, churches die and that's how it works, how do we live? Well, I remember the first time I felt this conundrum. And it was in 5th grade, and we were studying recycling and pollution and the environment. And I remember thinking about the huge scope, the global scope of this problem of pollution and the ozone and climate change and all of these things, and thinking, well, what in the world difference does it make if I recycle or if I don't recycle? It doesn't make any difference at all, right? If you put your recycle bin out this week or you don't, that is not going to change the grand scheme of where this planet is headed, right? And yet at the same time, if everyone believes that, if everyone believes that they can't make a difference, then no one will make a difference. On the flip side, if enough people believe that they can make a difference will be made, right? It's this weird place where nothing matters, no individual thing matters, and yet individuals believing that what they do matters does matter. And we face a challenge because in our culture, everything feels globalized. Whether it's the news or corporations that always have to be expanding and growing and getting bigger and profiting more, everything has to be absolute. We have this idea that there has to be this one superhero who gets it all right, who will save all the things. And it just doesn't work that way. Carl Jung puts this conundrum the best. He says, the universal is in the particular. The universal is in the particular. Humanity is this huge, complex thing, and yet it's made up of it's irreversibly made up of individual human beings, or it's nothing at all. And so I think because we believe in God, especially a God who became particular, especially a God who is always creating and renewing in things like mustard seeds that start tiny and grow into great things, I think we can live in this reality. I think we can. Paul puts it this way in a letter to the Philippians. He says, to me, living is Christ and dying is gain. He says, I can't choose between the two. If I go, I go, and this will go on without me. But if I stay, there is good work for me with you. Paul didn't know he was writing scripture that would last for thousands of years. Paul just realized that there was something eternal that could happen in him, in his particularity, giving his life to this little bickering community of Jesus followers in Philippi, a city we wouldn't even know today if Paul didn't write this letter to them, even as he himself sat in a jail cell. And so he's the same one who later in the same letter said, I've learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little. I know what it is to have much. In all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and going hungry, of having plenty and being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Right? As followers of Jesus, we can live in any of the forms. That's something so beautiful about the gospel. Any of the particularities can be a place where Christ is working. We don't have to preserve one particular form, one particular name, one particular way of telling the story. We can have or we cannot have. We can be in prison or not be in prison. We can be living or we can be dying. And in all of these particularities, Christ is at work. And at all times, in any circumstance, whatever we are going through, somehow we can be joining in that work in the tiniest way, offering ourselves up to the patterns of Christ and trusting that this is what it's all about, even if none of it depends on me. And so now let's go back to Acts 2. Let's go back to this beautiful family portrait that we got there, knowing that it's not the full picture of the early Christian community, knowing that even that community was messy and dealt with challenges and struggles inside and outside, knowing that even as faithful and devoted as they were, it didn't lead to some perfect and ongoing Christian congregation in Jerusalem. And so with those burdens off of our shoulders from this little portrait, what can we learn? Well, we can ask, what does this portrait tell us about what we are stewarding as followers of Jesus? What is our purpose and goal? Where should we be directing our energy and focus and resources as a community of Jesus followers? Well, can we devote ourselves to the apostles' teaching, right? The story of Jesus? Can we devote ourselves to fellowship and breaking bread? Can we devote ourselves to prayer? Absolutely, we can. We can do that in small and particular ways, no matter what the outcomes are, no matter what where the waves are flowing around us. We can do those things, and we have been. We've been doing that in our Wednesday Bible and book study groups, from reading Lisa Sharon Harper's A Very Good Gospel to poring over Esther on the porch over the summer. Or now we're just finishing up Austin Channing Brown's book, I'm Still Here. All of this is trying to shed our own modern assumptions about these stories and get to how liberating this gospel story really is. That's what we've been doing, devoting ourselves to the apostles' teaching and the story of Jesus. We've been devoting ourselves to prayer at Check In and Pray. And even though it's virtual and there aren't always a whole lot of boxes on the screen, I can tell you that Christ is there. In the laughter and in the tears and in the prayers that we have shared, Christ has been there, and it's beautiful and it's good, even if it's messy and if it's not this grand prayer movement that maybe some of us would want it to be. We're trying to reconnect the breaking of bread and the fellowship. We're trying to reconnect the ritual and the meal here at Point Place UCC, and we did that last week. We brought all of these things together, the breaking of bread and the fellowship and the story and the prayer. We tried to bring it all together at Pancake Church last Sunday, and we're going to try and do it again on December 5th. As a church, this is how we steward the gifts of God: tables and stories and prayers. And the form that stewardship takes over time, how those gifts manifest themselves in the world, will change and shift over time. Not because we're trying to cater to some cultural moment, but simply because that's what the gospel is. It's about death and it's about resurrection. It's about ancient traditions being born somehow anew and being raised in new ways. That's what it is. Institutions will rise and crumble, but this is how the church will stumble forward, because this is where Christ is. And so as we talk about stewardship, which is a word that can mean and feel like a lot of things for a lot of different people, I want to make 2 points. The first is that this is what we're stewarding. Let's be really clear. What the church is stewarding is not primarily money. What the church is primarily stewarding are tables and stories and these points of connection between divine grace and human messiness. That's what we've received. That's what we have to offer to the world. So that's the first thing we need to think about when we think about what stewardship is about. And so then point 2 is that when we talk about financial giving and we talk about budgets, those are the questions that we can be asking. How are we resourcing this deeper stewardship of table and story and connection? Are we setting these tables? Are we telling these stories? Are we facilitating these connections where lives are truly being shaped through encounters with the divine coming into the messiness of their lives? And if so, then give to that. Invest in that. Resource that. Or let's work to change it. Let's continue to shift or declutter until we're super clear that Point Place UCC is not integral to the ongoing advancement of the kingdom of God. And yet, when we set tables and tell stories and draw divine and human together, we are living and experiencing and incarnating what the eternal gifts of God are all about in particular places and times and among particular human beings. And so I look forward to this stewardship work with you, to setting more tables in particular in the coming year. I'm looking forward to some more breakfast church experiences. I enjoyed worshiping with pancakes. I'm looking forward to doing house blessings again. These have been some of the most beautiful experiences for me of getting to, again, kind of facilitate that connection, to hear your stories and get into the places where you live your faith out in particular ways, day in and day out, over a cup of tea or some water or whatever it is. Love that. And we've talked for years about maybe finding some bus or food truck kind of thing so that we can maybe set tables up wherever folks will eat and join us. And I look forward to stewarding those tables and sharing those prayers with Feed My Sheep as we continue, whatever form that takes. And I want to close with a story from Feed My Sheep because it goes with this setting the table idea. Because my job with Feed My Sheep, I don't do a lot of the things, honestly. We have some beautiful, wonderful people who cook and who clean and who box and who take things downtown. And I get to do that sometimes, which is really cool. But one of the things I've done in the last year, my contribution has been to set the tables. And it's been embarrassingly simple. All it involves is bringing up a couple folding tables from down in the basement and bringing them up and chairs and putting them in the parking lot. And when we hand out meals, there are some people who just drive through and grab their meal and go. That's what we've been doing since the pandemic began. But there are some people who want to stay. And when the tables are there, and one of them even texts me, "Hey, you going to set up the tables, Pastor John?" I say, "Yeah, I'm going to set the tables up." Because there are some people who want to sit at that table and want to connect. And there's something there. They realize that in some way, Christ is there, I think. And there's one particular guy. And we all exist day to day somewhere along the spectrum of joyful and bubbly and grumpy and a little miserable, right? And this particular guy, whenever I've met him, exists somewhere on that, grumpy and irritable end of that spectrum. And for some reason, I just felt led to encourage him or maybe cajole him to stick around. Instead of just grabbing his meal and driving away, I kept saying, "Come on, hey, just stick around. Hey, park your car up there. We'll put your meal at the table and you can join us." And eventually he did. And I can tell you that for whatever reason, when he was at that table, I've never seen him smile as much or laugh as much or tell his story or encourage other people. And I don't know what it was, but I think it's because that's where Christ is. Tables are where the Jesus thing happens. And in that sense, tables are the simple form that hope for the world takes. When we invest in table setting, in meal preparation, in the creative dialogue and connection that can happen when human beings break bread together, we are investing in eternal good. And so even when the soup is too salty, even when the conversations get a little heated, even when a stranger pulls up a chair and kind of disrupts that family feel, even those times when no one seems to have anything to say, even if familiar forms pass away, Christ will continue to be present as we set the table and leave a space for him. Amen.